Well, welcome to the second 1% Club Roundtable. This time it's focused upon the 4 key elements of successful storytelling. For those that know me, then sorry, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. For those that have, this is the first time you've engaged with us. So my background, Tony Lockwood. About 28 years ago, I was working for the Royal Bank of Scotland and was fortunate enough to be asked to join a transformation programme. And that lasted for about 2.5, 3 years. And when I moved back into steady state banking, it's fair to say that I enjoyed change and transformation more than banking, and decided that that was my career. So I left in '96, and for the last 25 years, I've been working in project programme and change management across multiple sectors, multiple organisations, different sizes of projects, some matters of weeks, some 2.5 years, and thoroughly enjoy it. Back end of 2017, I'd got bored, I suppose, of leaving the house at silly o'clock on a Monday morning and going to the other end of the country and staying in a hotel for a week and coming back on a Friday. So a colleague and I decided that we would do something slightly different and really set up a peer-to-peer network. We called it Thompson Wright Partners, and it was working with change and transformation directors to help them put teams together by delivering or working with people that we've built relationships up with over the last 25 years. And that went really well and probably went too well, because we started to get HR involved and procurement involved, because they saw us as a recruiter. And although we were operating in that recruitment space, our raison d'etre, I suppose, was the fact that we could have peer-to-peer conversations with the directors and really understood what they were looking for. COVID hit, and we went from healthy revenues to zero revenues within the space of about 14 days. I sat back and asked the question, what does the future look like? And that's where we started to pivot into the Transformation Leaders Hub, which is a network to get back to that real sort of sense of peer-to-peer. Let's build relationships, help people to build relationships that can open up opportunities. And so that was set up September last year. We've grown steadily over the last 12 months. And recently we've launched these 1% Club, which is roundtables, which is very much about helping people within the network and people who are operating in project program change management with those sort of marginal gains that can help them to stand out from the crowd, to be a little bit better in everything that they do, really. And working on the principle that Sir Dave Brailsford did in the UK cycling team, where it was, if we can take everything that we do and improve by 1%, the overall impact is significantly better than just a 1% uplift. So that's the concept. So the format of this is, a little bit of presentation, a little bit of key messages around the subject area. So the 4 elements of successful storytelling today, but then we open it up and have discussion, and be interesting to get your input on the subject area and your experience of using storytelling in your career, whether that was to help you win business, or whether that was to help you win a new project, or within the sort of the project delivery aspect. So is that okay? Shall we go into the formal presentation bit? Yeah. We're looking at storytelling today, and I suppose that what I've just told you about me was my story, and I think, in my experience, having clarity around your story is a really great way of just building rapport, is starting to introduce yourself in a different way. It puts that whole sort of context of what you're going to say into a clearer light. And I suppose if you think back to childhood days, that's what we were brought up to on, wasn't it? It was about stories, it was about reading, it was about sort of getting your mind and visualizing stuff off the back of the page. And for those of us of a certain age, certainly in my childhood, I always remember at 4:30 every weekday, there's a program on TV, because there's only 4 channels at the time. There's a program on TV called Jack and Ori, and it was someone sitting in telling you a story. I think there's a way of telling stories that really hit people and really sort of build on the emotion. And if you can really focus on the emotional and hit people at an emotional level, it's far easier to get them to take action, and the actions that you want them to take, because ultimately decisions are based primarily upon emotion. So if we go into looking at what considerations we should do when we're thinking about whether storytelling is something that we can incorporate into an engagement or a piece of work that we're undertaking. I suppose the key thing, like anything, is what's your objective? What's your objective of trying to wrap around a story? Being clear about that objective will give you a much greater insight into how you structure the story moving forward. Secondly, what do you want your audience to do? What actions do you want your audience to take? That's a critical aspect, because again, I think it was Stephen Covey says, start with the end in mind. And if you can start with the end in mind, then you're in a really good place to really understand what you can and how to structure the story, shall I say. Looking at the subject matter, if what tends to be good is if you've got a success to share, or equally a failure or a moment of clarity. So really being clear about what the hook is for someone. And it might not be a story that you've been involved in, it might be a story that you've observed, but you've taken the lessons that you've observed and you're relaying that into a story that people can follow. But the key is, let's get a hook. And for those of you that attended the session last week, the roundtable last week, where we looked at how you could position your LinkedIn profile in the best possible way, we talked about AIDA, which is a marketing term. So can you get their attention? Can you build their interest? Can you build their desire? And can you get them to take action? And the hook is grab their attention. So it's essential that you grab their attention, because once you've grabbed their attention and then you start to relay the story, there's been much more of an emotional attachment to that story than there ever was before. So the 4-step approach that we want to take you through, the first aspect of the 4-step approach is the context. So let's be clear about the context that we're talking in. So if you remember my story previously was, I sort of set the context to say, I'm like you, I'm a project program change manager. I've worked in the industry for 25 plus years. And the context of why we're moving into what we're doing now was, I realized back in 2017 that I'd had enough. And that was my hook, really. If you are in that sort of similar situation, it probably struck a chord with people. Yeah, so once we've done the context and really started to put that starting point in, it's then starting to look at the challenge. What challenge have you faced, or what opportunity did you have? So that you, again, start to get people's emotional attachment to what you want to talk about. If they've experienced a similar challenge or a similar opportunity, they're much more likely to become engaged in the conversation and the story, and start to really take into account some of the experiences that you've had. The third aspect is the conflict. Did you have a conflict? Did you, people like to hear about a struggle, and they like to understand the sort of process that you went through when you were overcoming that challenge and that struggle. So it's key that you start to emphasize the challenge or the scale of the opportunity that you're facing, because that again will get people bought into the story. Back in 2020, beginning of 2020, I started a podcast, and it's just an interview with people, and it's called Inside Track Business Transformation Journeys, and it is just a discussion between me and the guest about their experiences of driving through change and transformation within organisations. And the very best ones that we've done, and where the feedback has been really sort of the best feedback that we've had, have been where the guests have really started to explore some of the challenges that they've faced and how they've overcome it. Because I think people are always naturally sort of pulled towards challenge and learning from people when they've overcome that challenge. And then the final aspect is resolution. So you've sort of set the context, you've identified the challenge that you were facing and the conflict that you look to overcome. But now let's really focus upon the resolution. What did you do, and how did you turn people around? And people can learn from that. And if you can put the discussion in a way that you really start to drive against the emotions of the people, and you really start to demonstrate the transition that people have been taken through from where they were to where they've got to, that is an essential part of a really good story. So what is I suppose is the question that we all need to ask when we're putting together stories, in terms of whether that is a story to help you win a new project, win a new client, turn a stakeholder around. You know, they're naturally going to ask that so what question. To answer that so what question from their perspective, you've got to highlight the key lessons that you took through that process, and really emphasize and put it into their language as much as possible, the recipient of the story. You've got to highlight what it means to them, because a story is good in general terms, but if it doesn't mean anything to the person that you're conveying the story to, they'll listen, but they won't really buy into it. So the more you can make it relevant to the person that you're engaging with, or the people that you're engaging with, the more it means to them, the more emotional attachment that they'll have to the story and to the actions that you're looking for them to take. And that leads on to the next thing. It's really focusing upon the actions that you want people to take and you recommend people take. And if they've got the emotional attachment through going through that 4-stage process, they'll naturally start to want to take the actions that you've taken, because you've been able to demonstrate to them that you've taken people from A to B in a successful way. So remember, these are the key messages, I suppose, as we go through. Stories should be relevant and relatable. They should include emotion and appropriate language. And when I say appropriate language, I mean appropriate language to the recipient. So if you can start to talk in their language, they'll buy into it a lot more. So going back to my story, I suppose I've deliberately moved throughout my career, across multiple sectors. The commonality has been I'm delivering project program change management, and the process of delivering change is relatively consistent. But what you find in different sectors is the language that people use is different. It takes you a couple of weeks to pick up that language, but as soon as you start to pick up that language and you start to talk their language, people move forward a lot quicker. But you know, I learned very early in my career, going in and talking to a manufacturing business with the language that I would use in financial services, just turned people off. It was almost I was talking French instead of English. It just, you know, it wasn't striking a chord. As soon as I stepped back and start to understand why that was, and understand the nuances of the language that was applicable for the manufacturing industry, we were able to move forward a lot quicker. The key, I think, almost is also to replace the generalities with specifics. So the more specific that you can be in terms of people, the approach, the sector, the type of organisation, the problems that they were facing, rather than generic theoretical sort of discussions, the better. And again, that's the feedback that we've had from the podcast. People like the podcast because we talk specifics rather than just generic approaches. And don't make it too long. 3 to 5 minutes is great. Much longer than that, you start to lose people. So keep it short, snappy, and very focused on those four sectors, four stages, and try to do it in a conversational style. It's key to be unscripted. If people feel that you are just reading a script, they won't buy in, they won't get the emotional attachment that you're looking for. But having said that, it's key that you've got a script in the background, that you've got a process that you understand what the messaging that you want people to go through. And that's where that sort of four-stage approach works very, very well to give you that structure as you go through the story. When to use stories, to introduce yourself in a networking environment or in a presentation when you're meeting people for the first time, in a sales pitch if you're in the consulting world or looking to win new clients. When overcoming objections within a program, I've always found that the easiest way of overcoming some objections, stakeholder objections, sponsor objections, etc., is to talk through stuff that you've done in the past or stuff that you've seen in the past in a story way, using stories rather than just facts in coming back with a factual response. Interviews is always useful. Rather than just talking generically, this is what I would do. I've always found that if you can go and say, this is what I did when I found this situation in this organisation, and talk through the story that you went through, always very useful. Workshops, again, similar sort of thing to what we've been talking about. The more specific you can focus in your stories in workshops, the better and more engaged people will become within those workshops. And finally, to build rapport. People like stories. People enjoy hearing stories. If you are, again, going back, talking to them in their language about subject areas that they're interested in, you'll immediately get that rapport. So that's four things to help you on the storytelling world. It'd be interesting just to get your flavour and your experience and some stories from you, really, about when you've successfully used storytelling in your career today. Does anyone want to share a story?
Tony, Clive, certainly from my perspective, when I'm selling my services, and somebody's talking to you about, for those of you who don't know, I'm an interim in the sort of supply chain operations and logistics space. I've viewed going for assignment interviews, if you want to call it that, not really as an interview. I found it easier to view them as I've already assessed whether this role is for me and I can do it, and I'm going there to have a conversation about whether I can solve this company's problems. And it's about talking about some of my past experiences, and I use some case studies. So rather than plowing through a classic interview with a CV and stuff like that, they've had my CV, they wouldn't be talking to me and I know I could do the role because I wouldn't bother going for the interview. But it's about using those case studies, whether you actually sit the case study. Certainly when we used to do face-to-face, I used to turn up with 3 or 4 relevant case studies and get into talking about those whilst they were reading them. I'd bring them to life in a sort of story format. Yeah. And that was massively powerful. It's a bit more challenging to do that remotely because you've got to share a case study and talk at the same time. But certainly having the case study there to give them the facts about what they did and what happened, and this is what I saved, or this is what I did, and a quote from the client, hopefully. But it is about telling the story, that customer's problem, what they had, what you found when you got there, and what you did and what you delivered and how you left it. Yeah. And I think that's a very different approach to having conversations when you're going to it's not an interview where they're interviewing you. There's almost a pitch, but it's not a sales pitch, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I think case studies are very relevant, and I encourage everybody to pull together after every program, every project they've completed, pull together a case study, and I use a very simple approach, and it's what was the situation or task, the sort of situation that you found yourself in. What was the task that you were asked to complete? What actions did you take, and what were the results? That STAR principle. Yeah. But that's fundamentally follows that same 4-stage approach that we've just been talking about, and they're very, very powerful. And I know certainly people that I've interviewed in the past who've come in. I might have asked them a specific question, and those people that have come in and given me a generic type of answer against those people that have come in with that sort of STAR principle of case study and what they've done. I've always gone down the route with the person that's come in with this is what I found when I was working with this organisation, and told me the story that they've gone through. It's much more believable, and it's much more tangible.
I think the other example that I use is once I'm in an assignment and in the first few weeks is you're coming in, you're an unknown to many of your colleagues, your peers, those who are working for you, and it's about you need to go and develop credibility, and they're like, well, where have you come from? Why are you my new boss on a temporary basis? And often, I quite like the previous boss, and he was sacked 2 weeks ago, and now you're here. So there's that whole sort of piece about building your credibility by explaining to them in fun terms that this is what you do, you're experienced at doing this is normal, being thrown in is normal, and you've got this wealth of experience without being arrogant and without showing off. It's about dropping those into the conversations that it rapidly builds credibility and therefore trust that, oh, actually, I think Clive does know what he's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Brendan, you've put your hand up.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, just to pick up on the STAR, my previous experience was for the Association for Project Management doing registered project professional assessments. So that was all about listening to other people's stories and trying to determine whether or not they were competent. And the key thing for me was the number of times that you had to prompt people to talk about what they did, because we all work in teams and collaboratively, and they'd say, kind of what was achieved and what the kind of the outcome was, but not really focusing on what they did to facilitate that. And I think that's really important in terms of the narrative that you're trying to put across.
Good point. Absolutely. Yeah, I remember I got introduced to STAR principle back in the Royal Bank days, so 30 odd years ago, and when it first came in, that was one of the key messages that came out. Talk about what you did, and equally, if you are interviewing people, push them to see what they did, because people do tend to talk in generalities. Thanks, Brendan. Jeanette, I think you put your hand up as well.
Yeah, a little bit like one of Clive's examples, really. Recently I took on an NED role where, the NED role is quite remote from colleagues anyway, who are at the sort of sharp face of the business. And there's been several issues in this organisation previously, and a fair degree of mistrust and definitely suspicion around the board and the directors. So I use the storytelling format to go in and do some visits face to face with people. And actually, it was less about, the reason why it was storytelling rather than me just sending my CV in was they can read my CV if they want to on LinkedIn. It's there for everybody to see. But actually, they were more interested in me. They were more interested in what's important, how's she going to play in this role, what's going to be important to her, what's she going to ask us to do, what are the threats, if any, upon us, and what are the big objectives. And I don't mean the objectives of the organisation, because again, they're very clear and on the organisation's website, but they wanted the story to find out about me, to find out about whether there was a threat, whether they could trust, and whether there was any reason to be suspicious as there had been previously, and it was really, really useful.
No, absolutely interesting. You reminded me of something else actually. Something that I've used quite well in the past when I've been going into organisations, and you starting doing that sort of initial fact find, is when you're going in and meeting people for the first time, you do it in reverse and almost like, tell us your story, tell us about you, tell us what you've got involved in all that sort of stuff. Because people love talking about themselves, and I suppose it goes back to some real basic sales training. But if you can get people to talk about themselves, they open up, and just asking that question in that way tells your story. And interestingly enough, we on every one of the podcasts we open it up in the same way. Tell us your background, tell us your story. So you can turn it on its head and use it in that other way. Paul, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just saying, just to add to your elements, Tony. I think one of the key things is about actually listening, because part of it's very easy to, in a situation, to set off on your story, and you've got the narrative and you're running with the whole thing. Whereas actually, if you're not listening to or reading the signs from the other parties, then you very quickly lose them. And I used a kind of a storytelling technique, and it was a bit of the reverse, as you said, but actually it was in an interview situation, and the interviewer asked me about my experience. And so rather than sort of go, well, when I was 15, I had a paper round, and as some people do, I started with what I did last week, and sort of just gave them, as Jeanette said, my CV's there. You can see my work history and my employment history. So I played back a story of, well, the most recent project I did was this. Here's what it was. Here's the action, using the STAR principle. And I did that and gave them sort of 2 or 3, and then said, did they want any more? And so I'd used kind of a combination of those things, but in a kind of reverse chronology, rather than trying to build my credibility by telling my whole story from start to finish. I kind of gave them the last chapter first.
Yeah. Start with the end in mind, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Cheers. Thanks, Paul. Matt?
Yeah, actually, it's just to play to your points, from Clive's point to yours to Paul's, about the listening, that transition from to the listening, rather than going in. And that I recall a story of when I landed at the insurance company LV, and 3 weeks prior, the managing director of this legacy business at Liverpool Victoria had walked, and he was in charge of this project, and so they needed someone else to come in and kind of get it on track, because it was 3 years behind, and it's a regulatory program. So in that kind of context, there was a great opportunity for me to kind of go out and reach out to the key people that had just been identified to come into this program, to say, tell me what's going on, tell me what's gone wrong, tell me where we are, tell me what you try and tell me what we're trying to achieve here. And then and that was primarily just reaching out first. I didn't need to introduce where I'd come from. I'd just come from a board level position for another insurance company. So it was a case of a bit to your point just now, Paul. It's like the CV does that for you, but not everyone wants to hear your CV. But the one thing that I found consistent in my career in financial services is most people that will get involved in teams and in our areas don't have the opportunity to be heard. And if we just use, I love this expression that I heard years ago, use your ears and your mouth in the right percentage, or proportion. It's a classic one, isn't it? But it's, I found, relatively inexperienced in this kind of transformation world, having been mostly front of house, commercial type director, business development type thing. I found that just by listening to people, I could fathom through the complexities to arrive at, and helping people to get at the simplicities, and referencing that back to what are we trying to achieve and by when. And let's now discuss, some options and ways forwards and how we're going to do that. So I think it's absolutely crucial, that listening bit. Actually helps you enormously. They feel empowered. They don't, all of a sudden, they're concerned about but I really like that ex-boss of mine that's just been fired. That's gone out the window, because all of a sudden you've come in and said, tell me what you think, you know, and in the LV scenario, there was an old laggard there that had been 30 years, and he was my number one problem child. And I thought, I like problem children, because if you actually go to problem children and ask them what the problem is, you might have to be there a week listening to them, as it turns out, because they haven't been heard for 30 years or whatever.
Yeah.
But actually, in amongst all the camouflage, there's some real kind of classic help there, and classic things that you can expand upon, and to help navigate the way through and get those people on board. They become ambassadors eventually, but they're normally hard and crusty, and they're set in their ways. But give them the opportunity to be heard, and they like you for it, and it stands out from the crowd.
Absolutely, and if you can convert those, you as you say, you've got a very influential advocate in many times, and it's a classic way, as you say, of converting them. Just going out and listening to them, and letting them tell you their story. Absolutely. Nick.
Thanks, Tony. I mean, I think interesting what Matt was saying about listening more than talking, and I was reflecting on even when we're selling ourselves and telling a story to sell ourselves, we need to listen more than we speak. And one of the ways that we end up, I find that I speak too much, is I don't know the detail of the story that I'm telling, and I'll wander around in little circles, and I'll embellish it, and I'll wander off, and I'll add a little bit more of an anecdote, and I'm sort of, you know, somebody's putting the tea on and getting the biscuits out, and if I'm not careful, I'll watch them. Their eyes will have glazed over, and my story is boring whatever out to them. And in my experience, what I have to be able to do is practice the stories I'm going to say, so that I know the STAR really, really quickly. I can get the story across, get my point across, get in, get out, and shut up, because then I can listen to what their next question is, or their next problem is, etc. And I'll shut up.
Now, that goes to that final point, really, of you don't want it to become too scripted, but you do need to understand the script and the structure. And as you say, short and sharp tends to work far better than long rambling ones, because you lose people's attention. Clive, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, my hand up was really just about audience, really, and making sure, I mean, you can tell the same story to different audiences, but you might need to sort of emphasize different things, or come at it tell the story in a different way, depending on the audience. So going back to the sort of winning business in the sort of interim sector, I might tell the same story to an agent, but I'd tell it in a different way than when I got to see the client, because the client hopefully understands the problem in detail, and you know, potentially understands supply chain and logistics, whereas the agent, however good they are, you know, they're more interested in your credibility. They don't really understand logistics and supply chain. So, you know, the detailed solution set that you put together, they're less interested in. They're more interested in your capability and how you came about it. But it might be the same story, just different audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, again, links back to what we were talking about earlier, about really understanding who that audience is and talking their language. And if you've got a very technical person or a very detailed person, you know, going back to Nick's point, you know, sometimes you do need to go into to labour the point a lot more and go into a lot more detail with those people. But if you've got much more of a visionary person, then they'll just probably just want the high level overview, and it's picking up and listening to them in observing them in those one-to-one sessions that will determine whether or not you go down that detailed route or the high level view. It's interesting, just to pose a question to you, really. Over the last 18 months, you know, the amount of time that you've been able to do face-to-face as opposed to using Zoom or Teams and stuff has obviously swung significantly. Do you feel that it's harder to get a story across in this medium as it is in a face-to-face scenario, and what sort of what experiences and what lessons and what sort of thoughts do you have around that?
I think you have to accept the limitations of the tool, but I think you still have to apply the same disciplines in that sort of reading the body language, just like you were doing there, bit of nodding, bit of feedback, bit of kind of, you know, so that you get that rapport and that understanding, and you accept that the tool is a compromise, but you can still operate and work that way. I think what's more interesting, I went to an event last week, and the number of people who were trying to present who weren't talking to the back of the room, they were talking as if they were still on their screen. Right. And it was a really interesting behavioral thing, you know, a room with, you know, 40 or 50 people in it, and the presenters weren't presenting to the room. They'd been used to, you know, talking over, you know, 2 feet, not over. And it was a really interesting behavioral shift. So yeah, I think there's, you know, it's just about recognizing the tool is there, but also as we do get back to getting the opportunity for more face-to-face interactions, remember to talk to the room you're in, not just the 2 feet in front of you to the screen.
Good point. Thanks, Paul. Okay.
Yeah, no, I second what you were just saying, Paul, and it's very interesting because what I was going to say is that, of course, there are limitations with the video. However, what I do recommend to people is exaggerate a little bit their gestures, their body language. So it's almost like pretend that you are talking at a room, because there is a different level of energy. And that's sort of what we're missing with the video conferencing, is that level of energy, which I think is, you know, it's key to getting your message across as well.
No, absolutely. I remember many years ago, I did some media training. This was 15, 20 years ago. And that point came up. It's really, only when you mentioned it, it reminded me of it. But it was, if you are on screen, or even if you're up on a stage, be as demonstrative as you possibly can be, because all you're doing is keep trying to grab their attention back to you. So if all you're doing is looking and talking to a screen, then sometimes it looks like people are frozen, isn't it? But the more you can move around, you're going to keep grabbing their attention. And I'm not saying that you need to move around all the time when you're telling stories, but get emotion in the stories, get emotion in your voice, really start to use your tonality. And keep pulling people back to that sort of core emphasis that you want, the core message that you want to get across. Nick?
On that same sort of vein, our video chat means that we get to see ourselves when we're speaking, which is not natural. Maybe it's only me and everybody else is going to laugh at me, but I'm watching myself, not watching the person I'm speaking to. So I have to learn that actually, if anything, you know, if you can, hide your own video and talk to the person that that's in the room. And if it's in a group of people like this, when somebody's coming up, look at that person, because even if you don't have the you know, you're not directly engaging, you are engaging emotionally and intellectually with that individual. Absolutely.
No, thanks, Nick. So we're coming up to 14 minutes past 10. So we did say it was going to be a finish off at 15:15. But any last comments or questions before we close up?
Oh, I think it was a great session.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. It was a good reminder of some of the principles. A bit refreshing. Good.
Brilliant. Sorry, go on.
I don't know if you can hear me. It's Kelly Kilner. I work at John Matthews, the transformation lead. So just a couple of takeaways for me during this meeting of this morning. First of all, I'm meeting a new head. We've got a new head of internal communications joining our business. She's been appointed. So I'll remember this. I'll remember part of my introduction to her, because of course first impressions count. Secondly, on the tips of using Teams or Zoom, and I've noticed, of course, naturally we're all sat down, but what's been interesting on a couple of occasions when people have actually stood to present, I've noticed that is actually really quite powerful. Yeah. Not enough people do it, but when it has happened over the last 18 months, certainly in our organisation, I think it's very noticeable. It commands a room, but I know there's plenty of tips of having these type of conversations in this way remotely. And then just thirdly about the storytelling, and I think I take some of this back to my own background in public relations and writing news stories, and certainly the so what factor. I mean, if I'm trying to get something in the Guardian, what's great about my story? So all of that sort of background training is relevant for internal comms. And on the what we're doing a lot in Johnson Matthey at the moment, we've got a lot of employee network groups to support people who are, whether they're, there's a family group, there's a gender equality network group, there's all these like various groups. And often when senior people are presenting, they talk about their career journey, and we're using quite an interesting slide to talk about that. But that storytelling and all those points that were described earlier, Tony, which I've scribbled down, are good reminders for those people who are presenting when they're sharing their career. It's not just their career, it's more than that. It's a personal element of what inspired them to take that path. So yes, I've taken quite a few things from this session, so thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Kelly. The session's recorded. It's up. We'll post it into the Facebook group that we've set up for the 1% Club. So I'll send a link out to that on email over the next 24 hours or so. We'll put more and more stuff into the Facebook group as we move forward. So great that you can join us. Thank you very much for your contributions, and look forward to seeing you on a upcoming 1% Club Roundtable.